In the last video, we went over how to achieve a fake rolling shot, so I thought it would be cool to do a little walkthrough on an image that I've edited that uses similar principles, however fills in some gaps for effects and features that we didn't go over in the last video. Now this picture that we're going to be looking at is an interesting case because it's a fake rolling shot, but in the last video I stressed about taking two images, one with the car and one without. In this case we've only got just the one image, and that's with the car in. So I'll also be talking about how we deal with that as well. So without further ado, let's roll the intro and we'll get started. So basically this photo was sent to me to be edited as a present for someone else. Obviously he's into his cars, so I thought it would be cool to turn this still image into a very car mag looking rolling shot. I'm basically going to be taking you through the Photoshop file that I edited this car in, and you'll be able to see layer by layer what I've done to achieve the final look. So here's what the car looked like before my editing. And here's what it looked like after. So without further ado, let's jump inside of Photoshop. So as you can see, we've got the original image on the bottom layer. What we're going to be doing is flicking through each layer individually, and I'll speak a little bit about what each layer does. So the first couple of layers is adding some motion blur. Objects in the foreground of the image will be in a lot more motion blur than objects in the background. For example, the grass down here will be in a lot more motion blur than the bush in the background or even the sky. So what I've done is I've split the motion blur into two layers. So I've got the background first and then the foreground, and as you can see the foreground has a lot more motion blur to it. And for this I didn't actually use the path blur, I used the radial blur I believe, and I set it to zoom, basically set the center to over on the right hand side there. So if I flick on the next layer you can see that I've masked out the car. Well, some people might be wondering if it's that easy to just mask out the car, duplicate it on a new layer, and add motion blur to the layer underneath, then why do we normally have to take two photos? Well, if we zoom in, we can actually see where we've got a bit of spill on the car images. You can actually see where we've got a bit of the car underneath blur. So how do we fix this? Well, basically what I did was I used the smudge tool and I smudged in the car, and because it's going along the motion blur, it actually worked really well in removing that kind of blurry halo that we've got going on here. So if I switch the next image on, you can see that I've done two things. One, I've added a spin blur to the tyres that are in shot. And you basically navigate to that by going filter, blur gallery and then spin blur, and I scaled them to fit the tyres there. The second thing that I also did was I blurred the reflections. Now normally this is like a dead giveaway when someone does a fake rolling shot or a edited rolling shot, is that sometimes they forget to blur the reflections, and like I say, that's normally a dead giveaway that is not a true rolling shot. But what I've actually done here is again used the smudge tool. I did experiment with using the path blur effect and a couple of other different motion blur effects, but overall the smudge tool just worked way better. So if I switch on the next layer, we can see that I've blurred the back tyre like so. So the way that I did that was by duplicating that layer, and I then added a path blur focusing on that back tyre. I then clicked OK and then masked out just that tyre. So we've basically just got a small image of that tyre in motion blur. So if I switch on the next layer, you can see that I've done exactly the same thing with the front tyre. Moving on to the next layer, you can see that I've experimented with using an ellipse to create this kind of hazy lens flare kind of effect over on the right hand side of the screen. Basically, you can see that the sun is coming from the right hand side, casting quite a harsh shadow. This was obviously taken on kind of high noon. I wasn't there myself to see when this was taken because this was just sent to me, but I can assume that this was done at high noon, maybe a little bit after that. So I thought I would try and add in maybe a lens flare or experiment with the idea of doing that. So if I switch on the next two layers together, basically what I've done is I've duplicated all of the layers and converted them to a smart object where I can then add a lens flare. As much as I love the lens flares that Photoshop comes with, I really don't like the horrible kind of sharp orbs that run down the screen when you do that. If you've used the lens flare effect in Photoshop, then you probably know what I'm talking about. So to take care of that, I basically duplicated that layer, and on the layer underneath I switched off the lens flare, and then again on the layer on top I rasterized that image and then used the paintbrush tool, set it to clear, made it quite big so there was plenty of feather, and just painted away those horrible dots, and that did a pretty good job of that. So if I go to the next image, so you can see that I've pretty much took all of the previous layers and turned them on its side, so I thought I would have kind of a Dutch angle going on to kind of, you know, emulate maybe that this car was going that fast that the camera guy was, you know, had to scramble to get this image, and, you know, it kind of happened off the cuff. To achieve that, I basically just angled this image a little bit. I just rotated it, and you can also see that I've done some adjustments in the camera raw filter to bring up that contrast, push it a little bit over towards the warmer tones, etc. If I switch on the next layer, you can see that we're basically getting rid of some of those unwanted reflections that look really nasty in the car. Like I said, it was obviously a photo that was taken at high noon, so it was a little bit of work getting rid of all of those horrible reflections, but we got there in the end. If I switch on the next layer, you can see that I decided to add in some headlights. I know you wouldn't use your headlights in broad daylight, but having your headlights on in car photos is kind of an easy trick to make the car look more cooler and more aggressive, and make the photo look a bit more dynamic, adding a little bit more light in there. So I decided to experiment with adding these in. What I've basically done there is added an ellipse tool. I've then added another ellipse tool, made it a different colour, completely opposite on the colour wheel, placed that in the centre. I've then taken the magic wand tool, made a selection using that centre circle. I've then clicked on the layer below, which is the larger circle, which is the one that we want. I've then hid the smaller circle, created a mask, and hey presto, we've basically got this kind of donut shape here. Duplicated that. I then went to the blending modes, and I think I used hard light. I then duplicated that a couple of times and added a Gaussian blur to create this kind of overexposed look to the camera, because that's what I feel like half of the battle is kind of thinking, well, it's not just what would look cool and what would look right to your eye, it's a photo, so you've got to think what artifacts would taking this with a real camera give, you know, how do cameras behave and how do they deal with light and colour. So that's basically the whole meaning behind creating this overexposed kind of look, what we've got going on here. So I then did the same thing for the other side. Oh, and by the way, I just masked out. You can see where I've masked out the where the donuts go outside of where the headlights would be. I've just masked that out, just using the pen tool and then creating a mask with that as well. So if we go to the next layer, we can see that I've started to add more ellipses using in the fog lights there. We've got the two at the bottom, and then the next one is the I don't know what kind of lights they are. Maybe they're the fog lights as well, I'm not sure, but I thought, what the hell, they might as well be lit up as well. Okay, so basically up till this point I kind of knew that I wanted this car to be jet black, and unfortunately it's not. Now I know that this was taken on a phone, so there was no way that they could have used a polarizing filter to cut out on some of those sky reflections, because you can see where the sky is reflecting in the bonnet there. It's giving this kind of bluey look to the car. I did confirm with the owner, and it is indeed a completely black car, it's not blue. So what I did was I made the image completely black and white, and that gave me a blank canvas to work with. I then duplicated that layer, bringing back the colour, and then painted out the unwanted area. So after this I took the image over into Lightroom, where I've made some final adjustments, and this is what I ended up with. What would you have done differently? You can let me know in the comments below. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to give me a like, press the subscribe button, and click that bell icon. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.